I'm Chris Hogg, and we are live at Inventures, and I'm sitting down with Danielle Gifford, Director of AI at PwC. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
So Danielle, let's start out where I want to dive into applying artificial intelligence within a small, medium-sized business, but your role at an organization like PwC, what do you help clients do? And then let's dive into what you actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question in terms of what my role is at PwC. And so a lot of times when we're working with clients, it can be private, it can be public companies, many times large enterprises, but it's really helping them understand, what is artificial intelligence and how to actually apply it in their business setting. And so it can be anything from thinking about their strategy and their approach to their organization, whether it's a centralized model or a federal model. It can be thinking about the governance inside. So who actually owns what and what are the different functions and capabilities. And then it can be everything from how do you actually build, deploy, and maintain models on the back end, depending on what companies are specifically looking for as they're kind of starting to go down this AI adoption journey.
So I imagine there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but for an SMB in Canada that's looking to adopt AI, like where are we today in terms of adoption? Where is it getting picked up? Kind of like a state of the union approach.
Yeah, really good question. So it's actually really interesting in Canada in terms of the stats and what we've seen. So about 80% of small to medium-sized enterprises are starting to play around with AI. 40% of those companies have actually started to embed AI into their strategy. And for those that are starting to use and adopt some of the tools, they're seeing a pretty significant outturn in terms of that ROI. I believe the stat is about 127% in terms of productivity gains and, cost takeout in terms of what the actual applications are. So small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada are starting to adopt and play with tools, but then they're also trying to figure out, well, where do I go from here and how do I think about it a little bit more strategically in terms of my business?
Are there any specific tools or applications where AI is going in? Like the ROI question, I'm assuming something that touches revenue, but maybe not?
Yeah, so it's interesting when we think about the maybe kind of hard benefits or the soft benefits when we're thinking about AI. And so when we think about the hard benefits, it can be anything in terms of cost takeout, increasing revenue, it can be efficiency, and then some of the softer benefits are really around that employee experience or that customer experience. And so specifically with any kind of small to medium-sized enterprise, where we're seeing a lot of the application and the adoption of AI is really kind of in some of those back-end office functions. So if you're thinking finance, operations, HR, marketing, there's a lot of new tools that you can specifically use that really help you kind of gain an edge in those areas. Because if we think about some of those back office operations, it's pretty manual, it's repetitive. A lot of times for small to medium-sized businesses, it might not necessarily be their competitive advantage. And so there's lots of vertical applications where these tools are kind of starting to democratize access, which has been really helpful for some of these enterprises and some of these groups.
With the adoption as high as you mentioned, I guess we're past the let's start out and try things stage. Where does tweaking need to happen, or where are you finding mistakes or need to optimize?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the biggest things I think with these kind of different groups is understanding how you're thinking about your data and your privacy. And so if you're just kind of giving your employees ad hoc access to ChatGPT or to Grok or to Cloud or to Lovable.
Nightmare?
Yeah, it's not a nightmare, but are they giving it sensitive information like personal data or client data? Are they giving it, potentially your company financials, which we know in terms of the stats is something that's happening. And so really making sure that you understand the tools that you want to use for your business and making sure that you know what is the sandbox within that environment that you want your employees to use and play those tools from a perspective of looking at your actual business. The other thing that I would say that's really interesting in terms of the adoption is looking at your actual current tech stack. And so if you're looking at HR and you're using Bamboo HR, or if you're using a certain financial software, or if you're using something for your marketing and maybe it's your CRM like HubSpot, all of these applications are starting to embed AI and generative AI into their platforms. And so knowing and understanding your tech stack and just enabling and turning some of those things on when you can makes much more sense than trying to build or buy a tool off the shelf to actually integrate into what you're doing.
With the rise of agentic AI and AI on top of AI on top of AI, Guardrails are often brought up when you're an SMB trying to figure this out and trying to scale with AI. Are you finding guardrails are needed in certain areas?
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the type of industry you're operating in. So if you're operating in something that's highly regulated, so if you're operating within finance, if you're operating within energy or utilities or even healthcare, you want to know and understand what are those different guardrails or privacy or data concerns that your clients might have as well. So one thing that's been really interesting that we're seeing is some clients, when they're working even with PwC, are actually putting into their contracts that you can use our information, but you can't actually input it into, any sort of large language model. And if you do, you need to prove to us that there is data residency within Canada or with even in a specific province. And so it's something that you have to keep in mind as a small to medium-sized business is, yes, you can use these tools, but where is the data actually residing? Is that kind of tool using your information to kind of train the larger system? And, let's say if something is to go sideways, do you have access to all that data that you can pull back out into your system? Do you actually own that IP, and what does that look like?
What about the team that is responsible for, not like we're past deployment, but if we're into optimization, are you finding organizations need to lead different or hire different?
Yeah, I would say from a leadership perspective, and we've all probably seen the memo from Toby on Shopify's approach, and we're seeing similar memos come
Everyone
out even from
AI.
Section U, and it's like you have to use AI, you have to defend your job from AI. Before you even ask for any sort of resources, you must kind of have to prove it. And so one of the things I would say is really having a firm stance on what is your company's approach, because whether you like it or not, and I think the stats are 7 out of 10 employees are using AI. And so if you have a stance as a company to the do's and the don'ts of when to use it, where to actually apply it, I think it's really helpful for your employees to know and understand. The other thing too, what we're seeing in some of these smaller enterprises, which I think is really helpful, is getting kind of like an AI task force or an AI council together. And it's not meant to be some rigid governance, but it's really meant to be a committee that has representation of HR and finance and legal and risk and some of your business unit leaders, so that they know and understand, some of the different use cases, or when an application let's say DeepSeek drops, or, Google just dropped VO today, which is something that's super exciting. But as a business, how do we handle that? And what should we do with that? Do we ban it outright? Do we encourage the use of it? And so having kind of that cross-functional group is really helpful, because it's not just AI in a silo anymore. It affects all of the different areas. And even the point you touched on around, people and workforce, I find often, people don't invite HR to the conversation, your human resources, but at the end of the day, your people are some of your biggest assets. And so when you're thinking about your approach, there's so much noise out there on LinkedIn, on the news, and people are really scared. Is this going to take my job? Is this something I'm going to have to compete with? How do I even teach my kids about this? And so having HR as a part of the conversation is something that's important, and really bringing your people on board with you as you go, not just doing it to them, doing it with them.
So I guess some final thoughts, if you have any key takeaways. If I'm an SMB leader, I've deployed AI, I need to optimize, sort of what's next? What are maybe there's a couple of key things to focus on to scale and be successful. Any advice? Yeah,
I would say first and foremost, my guidance is don't do AI for the sake of AI. Really make sure what you're leveraging it for in terms of the application, and understand what are the metrics you're looking at, because then that allows you to really benchmark, is this tool actually worth my time? If you're paying for, Copilot licenses and it's $40, $50, $60 a seat,
adds up, yeah.
It all adds up. It's the same thing even with our streaming services. We all have Netflix and Hulu and what have you not, and it adds up at the end of the day. So really making sure that when you're applying AI, you understand the application and you have those benchmarks in place to know that you are getting good value out of it. The other thing as well is not letting it kind of fade into the distance, keeping it top of mind, keeping it on agendas, making sure that people know and understand, that they're heard. And when you do have some wins in the business, that it's something that's also celebrated. And then finally, I would say, staying on top of your tech stack. Tech stacks are changing, they're evolving. Making sure that your tools are really working with you and not against you is going to be something that's really important.
Great advice. Danielle, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
For more info on AI and its deployment and utilization and optimization in small, medium-sized business, visit digitaljournal.com.